Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, Anthropic, OpenAI, and AI wars upon us.
The idea was no military use whatsoever. And now if you look at it, in 2026, we're just hoping they don't use it for autonomous weapon systems.
How the war in Iran is fueled by 2 years of AI-assisted genocide in Gaza. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Hey everyone. Has the Anthropic news made you rethink your use of AI? Let us know in the comments. And remember to leave us a review on your podcast app. It helps more people find the show.
My name is Heidy Khlaaf. I'm the Chief AI Scientist at the AI Now Institute, and I specialize in the implementations of AI in safety-critical systems.
So the perfect person to talk to today. Heidy, welcome to The Take. For most of our audience, this week has been filled with news about Iran, with the launch of the U.S.-Israeli war there and Iran's retaliation. But in the backdrop, there has been another battle brewing, and that is between the U.S. government and one of the biggest AI companies in the U.S.
The company refusing to give the Pentagon unrestricted access to its AI technology. The company says it's concerned about the potential of fully autonomous weapons without human involvement. President Trump now banning Anthropic from all federal agencies.
And then OpenAI is in the mix too, a place you used to work. The kicker, though, is these two conflicts aren't separate stories. They are intertwined. So Heidy, for someone who lives and breathes this stuff, as I imagine you do, how would you describe the week that was in AI to an audience that may not?
It's a pretty exhausting, but to be honest, an expected week, because a lot of people aren't familiar that companies like Anthropic and OpenAI have been pushing for their large language models to be used for military purposes in the last couple of years. And I think these deals have essentially gone under the radar until we're now seeing them being used in Iran by the Department of War. So, for example, OpenAI had a key mission statement in 2024 that it dropped that it would allow its models to be used for military purposes. And, this was a big deal for people like me who are working on these types of problems, but relatively unknown to most of the population. And similarly, Anthropic signed a really big deal with Palantir, who is a company that does data analysis and surveillance, to essentially enable them to use their systems for national security and defense purposes. So for a lot of people, we're suddenly having large language models be used to target and prioritize and, find coordinates to strike. For people who have been working on this, like myself, it's been something that's being built up for the last 2 years with the deals that we've been seeing.
Okay, so I want to dive deeper into this dispute between Anthropic and the Trump administration. But before we do, help us lay the groundwork for what we're talking about, because you mentioned large language models, or LLMs. And I think a lot of us, when we think of those, we're thinking of these friendly chatbots who help us write emails. But that is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about has reportedly been used in the U.S.'s war against Iran. Why does it trouble you? And what are we talking about there?
So in a nutshell, Anthropic had some objections around the language addressing the oversight for autonomous weapon systems when they're discussing with the Department of War, specifically because they believe that their models are not reliable enough to be used for them. And there's a lot of coverage that misrepresents Anthropic's position, to be frank, which is that they were somehow opposed to the development of autonomous weapon systems when they're not. And Dario clearly stated in follow-up interviews—
being the CEO of Anthropic.
Yes. They were actually willing to develop these systems, but seem to have wanted some assurances on oversight until they do so. And what also didn't help with the coverage is that a lot of people aren't familiar with the fact that Anthropic does use these models already for decision support systems, as we mentioned, with their partnership with Palantir. And for those not familiar, decision support systems are essentially tools that bring together a lot of intelligence and surveillance data like satellite images, social media feeds, intercepted phone communications, and they use them to make recommendations, including targeting recommendations. So the entire debate around this really hinges on this difference between decision support systems and autonomous weapon systems, where autonomous weapon systems are allowed to select and engage with targets without any further human oversight. So that's really the distinction that, is at play here between Anthropic and the Department of War. But for me, I am actually finding the entire framing of the whole issue pretty skewed because it really overemphasizes Anthropic's objections rather than the very, very dangerous territory that we're now finding ourselves in, where LLMs have now been normalized by AI companies and many militaries as a valid technology that can then be used for decision support systems and autonomous weapons systems. And this is very concerning because, for those who are unaware, LLMs are actually very flawed and inaccurate technologies where they hallucinate a lot of the time and can have as low of an accuracy rate as 50%, sometimes even lower than that. And they're also not very good at solving tasks outside of what they've been trained on. So they're very unlikely to be able to handle like new and uncertain situations, things like the fog of war. And so we should instead be raising serious questions about whether they can be used in military settings at all, instead of sort of being dragged in Anthropic's safety theater when they've already been compromised by deploying their systems for decision support systems.
So when you mention the ways it's been prioritizing targets to strike and used for targeting, what does that actually mean in reality?
So they're mostly used for what's called decision support systems. And these are essentially tools that bring together a lot of data. So you have things like satellite images, social media feeds, intercepted phone communications, and then they're sort of fed into the AI, or the AI is trained on them, sort of depending on what you're working with. And it then uses them to make recommendations, specifically targeting recommendations. So this could be anywhere from infrastructure, right? It could be military bases, it could be a hospital, it could be a school, or it could be specific individuals, which then they use different types of weapons to target. It could be a missile, for example, or it could even be a drone. But ultimately, the large language model made some recommendation about targeting specific infrastructure or individuals and then striking them.
Oh my gosh. And we know that there does tend to be a bias that humans have when it comes to trusting AI. It knows what it's doing, especially when these decisions are likely being made very quickly.
Absolutely. And we actually have a term for that in this industry, and it's called automation bias, which is this idea based on decades of research showing that humans often trust the recommendations of algorithms without corroborating other sources or checking if those recommendations are correct or not. And then when you're thinking about military operators, they're typically only given seconds to make these types of determinations. And when they're being bombarded with thousands of different targets to sort of verify, they're most likely just going to default to what the large language model is recommending.
Okay, wow. That's heady.
Yeah.
So let me recap to make sure we're all on the same page. A day before the U.S. launched the attack on February 28th, the Pentagon, now known as the Department of War, that is the new moniker, it blacklisted one of the biggest AI companies, which is Anthropic, for failing to meet its demands to be able to use the AI how it wants to for, quote unquote, all lawful purposes. And yet then they reportedly used Anthropic's AI model, known as Claude, to help with their military operation in Iran. And this, in the backdrop, is against Anthropic's demands or requests for how their model be used, right?
Well, I would say actually it's very in alignment with how their models are used with Palantir.
Palantir's most well-known clients include those in the defense and intelligence sectors. Palantir has also faced heavy criticism for its work with immigration and customs enforcement, as well as with the Israeli Defense Force.
First, I want to address the fact that although they banned them, they plan on phasing the models out. Well, that was the initial plan, right? And so all of Palantir's systems heavily rely on Claude. They can't just overnight remove those systems, replace them with another model. That's a big engineering problem and would probably take a lot longer than the 6 months that they estimated. Second, we now have Anthropic back at the table, right? So it kind of shows that all along this was safety theater.
Well, tell us what you mean. For those who aren't following us closely, let us in. What do you mean when you say they're back at the table?
They're back in negotiations with the Pentagon to essentially discuss a new type of agreement where their models can continue to be used either for decision support systems or autonomous weapon systems.
So that's why you're saying that the world shouldn't be lauding Anthropic for saying, hey, we don't want our systems to be used for these autonomous weapons. We don't want it to be used for mass surveillance of Americans.
Yeah, and I also want to talk about, the practicality of it as well. In practice, when you're looking at how decision support systems are deployed and how autonomous weapon systems are deployed, the big difference is that you have a human in the loop who then approves some sort of recommendation.
Right.
But that human is actually impacted by something we call in our field automation bias, which is this idea based on decades of research showing that humans often trust recommendations of algorithms without corroborating other sources or checking if that recommendation is correct or not. And so in practice, when you have a military operator under a lot of time pressure who is being given a few seconds to approve some sort of recommendation, you can see how the distinction between decision support systems and autonomous weapon systems is pretty superficial in practice. And so when you're looking at Anthropic now being back at the table and how they already use their systems for decision support systems, it shows that this was really just safety theater after all.
Okay, so I want to pick your brain here and give you a test case based on all these information that we're all getting on social media, and it's hard to parse out what's fact and fiction. So I want to read you a post from X. This is from Trita Parsi, who is an analyst on Iran, an Iranian American. And he writes, similarities between Israel's bombing of Gaza and Tehran are growing stronger. In both cases, it appears Israel is using AI without any human oversight. For instance, he writes, Israel has bombed a park in Tehran called Police Park. It has nothing to do with the police. But it appears AI identified it as a target since Israel is bombing all government-related buildings, and no one has bothered to check, he goes on to say. Now, of course, I can't independently verify this, but I am wondering your take on, does that sound plausible? Is that how this is working when there is not human oversight?
Absolutely. That's why we say that distinction in practice between whether or not you have something that's fully autonomous or not is actually, non-existent. And, when we're looking specifically in the case of Iran, with investigations from the Washington Post showing that it's been suggested that they've put forward hundreds of targets, including location coordinates, and they've prioritized targets as well. It's not really surprising to hear this anecdote. As you said, we can't really verify it, but that's very, very in line with what we've seen with Israel's use of AI models in Gaza as well.
Well, it is hard not to think of Gaza when we talk about this. We know that Plus 972 magazine reported AI was used by the Israeli military to generate targeting lists.
The report says Israeli intelligence sources who served in the current war told how Lavender collects information on almost all the 2.3 million residents of the Gaza Strip through a system of mass surveillance, and on a scale of 1 to 100 gives a likelihood that each person is a member of the military wing of Hamas.
Now, if I'm understanding this correctly, the technology is different, but it is perhaps a role for AI that could be used in Iran and elsewhere. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would say Israel uses many different types of AI, but they've also used frontier AI, which is the same technology in question, for Claude. But there's another vector that AI is being used for here, and that's to evade accountability for mass casualties when they're being used for targeting purposes. And that's because the very use of these systems makes it difficult to distinguish if some attacks were in fact deliberate, due to intelligence failures, or due to the lack of AI accuracy or the parameters that they were giving to accept an enormous amount of casualties. So it really muddies the accountability here and also obscures the fact that LLM speed is just a high-tech version of carpet bombing. And I think it's really important for people to remember that, especially now AI sets this precedent that normalizes these types of targeting practices, just as we saw in Gaza, and there's no accountability for it.
We'll have more with Heidy after the break. Heidy, here's the part where our plot thickens even more. We talked about Anthropic's Claude, but when this was all going down, the dust hadn't even settled before OpenAI CEO Sam Altman decided his company would fill that empty slot that Anthropic was leaving. Walk us through what happened.
Essentially, OpenAI said that they initially came to an agreement with the Pentagon under the same terms and the red lines that Anthropic had. And obviously, everyone questioned that, right? Why would they walk away from Anthropic and go through this really awful re-engineering process to re-implement a new model if it's just going to be the same red lines, right? And I think we kind of were given a lot of different information that changed and walked back on and then changed again. But ultimately, I think a lot of people saw that the language is really vague, right? It's, again, another type of safety theater. And then they ended up getting the contract, which is a fantastic way to get the in that they didn't have before for the entire, Department of War to rely on their models for, these types of missions rather than Anthropic's.
Of course, humans, we love a moral high ground. We love a good guy versus bad guy archetype. Do either of these AI companies manage to hold that high ground when it comes to this issue of artificial intelligence and warfare and mass surveillance? And I ask that because we saw Anthropic dethrone OpenAI for the #1 spot in Apple's App Store over these Pentagon ties. Where do you fall?
I think Anthropic just has much better PR than OpenAI. To be frank, I was actually at OpenAI when the split between Dario, who's now the CEO of Anthropic, and Sam Altman happened. So I got to sort of have the front seat to observe what went down. And I think ultimately...
Okay, pause. So this is juice, but not everyone is going to understand because Anthropic was born out of dissatisfaction within OpenAI, right?
Yes.
Briefly, explain how that happened.
There, I think, was a debate over what is the right safety direction for OpenAI. And so when Dario then created Anthropic, they use this to market themselves, right? Like, we will be the safe AI company. And we no longer believe that Sam Altman can carry that out.
Okay. So now there's this split, good guy versus bad guy.
Right. And I think a lot of people ask me, isn't Anthropic at least a little bit better because they sort of have, they're marginally better. Doesn't that count for something? And I have a very different perspective on it because I'm a safety engineer by training. And I want to make that clear. That's very different from what an AI safety person is today. A traditional safety engineer is someone who's worked on things like aviation, autonomous vehicles, nuclear plants, autonomous drones. These are systems where if they fail, people's lives are at risk. And that is my background by training. And so it's a very different type of engineering discipline than what big tech has. Because if your phone fails, no one's going to die. But if an airplane fails, a lot of people are going to die. And so safety engineering is a discipline that has existed for decades. And so when I'm seeing this battle between OpenAI and now Anthropic about safety, both of them co-opt safety. They use a lot of the same terms, but none of them actually care about real safety, which centers human lives, right? You have to make sure that no man of human is harmed or injured, or the environment for that matter, or assets, right? This is safety engineering 101. The safety that Anthropic and OpenAI sell have to do with things like artificial general intelligence, this idea that you're going to have this super intelligent AI that's going to come and cause an existential risks to human because they're going to have these magical capabilities of being able to develop nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and we must stop them before they get that opportunity.
Mm.
It's very, very, very different. It gives a cover of safety. They talk about all these safety pledges, but to me, that's not safety. And if you specifically look at Anthropic, when they sell themselves as a safety-first company, they were one of the first to do an agreement with Palantir, whose now systems are being used by ICE in the United States. Their
Right.
systems are also being used by the military. So as I've suspected from day one, they're talking about safety. They use the same terms, but they mean something completely different. Their systems are actually contributing to the everyday harms to human beings, and that's clearly not a priority to them.
Heidy, was this inevitable?
I definitely think that AI technologies are very, very expensive to build, the frontier AI technologies we're talking about today. And I think to justify spending that amount of money and energy on them, because they're so expensive, means that you have to go towards this direction where you want them to be implemented in everything, right? And I do think that a lot of these people have these strong ideological beliefs that there is some sort of super intelligence, right? But let's say that there is going to be in the future. You can't just ignore how humans today are being harmed by that. I do believe in AI as a technology, not the way that it looks like now. I mean, Alpha Protein by Google DeepMind, which looked at different types of protein folding mechanisms, which could mean medical breakthroughs in the future, is a really good example of AI, being good. But that's currently not where it's being developed. I do think that there's definitely a different way, but we sort of seem to be on the deep end in sort of promoting this use of frontier AI instead.
Yeah. Well, finally, Heidy, I wonder then, is this what you expected you'd be signing up for when you got into it?
So I think, early on, I had a lot of hope in this type of technology being used for good.
Hmm.
And I did join OpenAI for a brief moment of time where I tried to sort of bring the safety engineering principles to the company. And it became very clear to me that this is not their idea of safety, right? That they'd rather indulge in these sci-fi fantasies rather than thinking, how could this harm everyday people? And it became very clear to me early on that this is really about power concentration and amassing huge amounts of wealth, that I ended up leaving, working for big tech companies to try to pursue like independent ways in which we can show why we need to evaluate these systems and also how to build better AI. So I think for me, that pivot happened to me much earlier on than it does to other people. But I think people at Anthropic and OpenAI now are starting to realize the same thing.
Yeah, we saw an open letter of people at those companies who are calling on their CEOs to do the right thing here. Do you think there's hope that what you believe and what clearly they believe is the right thing might win out?
I do think that those letters that I saw actually made me a bit depressed because just over, I think 7 years ago now, when we had, Google employees walk out to protest Google's contracts with the Department of Defense at that time.
Yeah.
And the idea was no military use whatsoever. And now if you look at it in 2026, we're just hoping they don't use it for autonomous weapon systems. I think it just shows that the goalposts have moved quite a bit.
Dr. Heidy Khlaaf, thank you for worrying us, but opening our eyes to the reality that is there. I appreciate this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.